I'm here with Aaron Heckman, general manager of the Washington Justice, for a long-form GGRecon interview. We wanted to sit down, pick your brain about really a long time frame you've been in Overwatch.
Yeah.
And to understand where you're coming from, I think it's important to get to know what you did before you joined the Overwatch League. So what was life like before OWL?
Yeah, I think I got really lucky in that the job that I had immediately before the Overwatch League had a lot of parallels that I didn't even expect. So I was my most recent career before getting into the esports scene was I was a project manager at a startup called Palantir. It's like a data analytics firm that works a lot with the government. And the role that I had was I managed a team of engineers. And what Palantir actually does is they disproportionately recruit younger engineers than like most other firms will do. So we get a lot of straight out of graduate school or straight out of undergrad hires. And the similarities between managing a group of like extremely like savant level talented engineers immediately out of college and managing a bunch of gamers like immediately out of high school or college age are actually like remarkably similar. Like you're like the job description for the role that I was in was just like removing blockers is what they would say. So like you just want to get everything out of the way of the engineers, just let them do what they do and just pave the way for them so that if anything ever comes up, like it should hit you first and they should just be like smooth operating machines. And that's remarkably similar to like what we're trying to do with the players, right? They have something that they are in the top 0.0001% of the world at. And so a lot of what like a good team tries to do is just build an infrastructure that supports that. So that was me immediately before getting into esports. And then kind of a diverse career path before that. I went to university at Cornell University, majored in economics, focused on like behavioral economics and information systems, went into consulting and then into tech.
Did you play video games and did you follow esports actively during that career and beforehand in childhood?
Yeah. So not like my early childhood. I probably got into video games later than most other people. I had parents that weren't huge into video game time. So I like got really into video games in college. That was like one of the things where I was like out from my parents' roof and I was like, oh man, this is it. I played Team Fortress 2 a lot. That was kind of my segue into Overwatch, was like that was really my game. And then I remember like I watched a lot of Muselk and like he got into like the Overwatch beta and I was like, oh, this is really cool. And then like Overwatch was definitely my first esport. I played a lot of like single player and like AAA titles, and then Team Fortress 2 and then Overwatch were my first big like esport titles that I cared a lot about.
Were you one of those professionals that tried to make it as a player and then quickly realized that the mechanics aren't up to par? Or
I maybe like very early on, I was like, oh, I'm not bad at this game. But like, no, I never had like true aspirations. Like as soon as I saw where the skill level was, I was like, okay, like what am I good at? Like I'm good at these things, and these things are not playing the game to that level. So I still play a lot of Overwatch. But it's I'm never gonna be one of those people that's like, oh, if the team needs someone to sub in, we can throw my name on there. Like no aspirations of that.
Do you share the rating you are at?
Yeah, so I'm like right now I think 3,300. So like I flirt with like that diamond into masters kind of thing. When I was working with Wizard, he sat down, he was like, if we really sat down and like really tried, we could get you like into a better place. Because Wizard like would just out of nowhere just kind of like sit down and just like grind an account into top 500 because he just had that ability. He was like, you could do that too. And I was like, I don't like, on the one side, like I'd like to have it for the clout, but on the other side, I don't know how much better it makes me at my job.
Very true, yeah. Now, of course, it sounds like you had a great career beforehand. What makes you then take the leap into more unknown areas, that is esports?
Yeah. So it was very much like a push more than a pull. I think esports and the opportunity I had with the NYXL came up at a time where I wasn't necessarily looking to get into esports, but I was looking to get out of my previous career. Palantir and startups in general are very, very exhausting, right? Like I'd been at Palantir for a couple of years. The work-life balance culture there was typical for a startup. So like I wasn't seeing my girlfriend at the time a lot. I wasn't really getting home very much. I also was kind of getting disenfranchised with the business model. The direction the company was going in, I didn't really believe in. So I was looking for other opportunities. I put some money away, so I took a break. And during that break, my girlfriend moved to Austin, Texas, then fiance actually, to work with FEMA. And so I followed her and started looking for job opportunities, specifically biasing towards things I was interested in and I would enjoy, because I was not feeling a lot of that at my last job before I left. And so I was like, I was spending a lot of time watching esports at the time. And I followed Wizard because I also like traditional sports. And I liked Moneyball and that whole image that he painted. And then that's actually how I got into the industry, was responding to one of his tweets asking for, I forget if he had been convinced to rebrand from data slave to data analyst. Right. One of those two was what he was asking for, and I applied to one of those.
That's interesting that you moved out and then came back to New York, right? Did you want to go back, or?
So I actually worked remotely the whole time I worked with NYXL. So I was in Austin. So the nature of the role that I had with the team was Wizard had a group of, I believe, like 6 data analysts. That at the time, the data feed coming from Blizzard was not fantastic. We didn't have the replay viewer. A lot of the tools that are used now for analysis just didn't exist. And so Wizard had put together this system where there was just a ton of manual video review, a ton of manual data collection. And I talked to him about it. And I think the reason that I ended up getting the job was he was asking for like one more person to do that. And I kind of like sent him a reframe, and I sent him like messaging that was, what you need isn't another analyst. What you need is someone to run these analysts so that you can keep doing your job. And like that person can just distill all of this knowledge and give it to you in efficient chunks so that you can work with the players. So that's what I was doing. And it actually worked out really well because all of those analysts were in Korea. So they were remote anyway. I would kind of work with them, work with Wizard, and then kind of most of the information that I was doing with NYXL was going through Wizard until he left. And then I worked more with Rohit and Farzam, who were like their kind of ownership management duo.
You mentioned the work-life balance at the old job. Is that actually much better now in this job and also previously?
Yeah. I think it's a lot better. In particular, what worked really well is, I think more than anything, it's just the offsetting of the hours, because my day when I was working, when everyone was in California, like there's the offset there, or the Korean time. So I usually get like a morning or an evening of just family time. If I wake up at like 8 a.m., like the gamers aren't up till like 11, right? And so like I have like this nice little 3-hour time window that's like I can go to the gym, I can like spend time with my family, and that's been great. And then like I was like looking at jobs in teaching just because I liked the idea of, oh, you can get a whole summer off. Like that's just built into the job. That sounds great. And that's built into this. Like I don't mind working the like 6-7 hour week, or 6-7 day weeks in season, and then in the off season, like the hours are still there, but you get a lot more control over saying like, oh, I'm going to take an hour long walk with the dogs when my wife's name is Shanika, when she gets home, and I can just schedule around that, right? It's like I'm like leaving an office, like a workplace where everyone has to be there for set hours. So that's been really nice.
How's the average hour in terms of enjoyment? Is that something you really vibe with now, or is it also still some parts of the job just being really not a slog, but the type of hours that nobody really likes to do,
Yeah, the ratio is way better. It's frankly like very high. Like I try not to look at the job too much through like rose tinted glasses, especially when people are trying to get into the industry and they're asking me, oh, do you enjoy your job? Should I try to get this job? Like I love it. Like a overwhelming majority of the time that I spend is spent doing things that I enjoy. And also like for me, it's things that I feel I'm good at. And so I disproportionately enjoy things when I can feel like I'm achieving outcomes and doing like good work. So yeah, I think there's a little bit of like blocking and tackling, but even in that, like I probably even in like these 3 years, I haven't really lost the honeymoon period of the industry. Like even the visa slog or those things, it's like, oh, this is cool. Like I'm trying to bring a cool player into the country for the first time. They're leaving Korea, they're coming into this really cool opportunity, And so like, yeah, like visa filing isn't fun, but it's easy to step back and look at it and be like, oh, this is something that if I was outside of the industry and someone said, hey, do you want to try and bring like a top tier professional into a country to work? It's like, oh yeah, that's a cool thing to do.
The interesting part about your job descriptions, from analyst to, I believe, assistant coach to general manager, is that it does sound like they are very different things, but the way you're describing is sort of like the facilitator between all the little cogs in the machine, and you're kind of like connecting in that regard. Has that been like the connecting thing between all these three jobs that you've had in esports?
Oh yeah, no, you nailed it. Yeah, and even like when, I mean, the titles in esports are pretty like, I mean, like even this year in the Overwatch League, people have gotten very creative. We have like co-head coaches and associate head coaches. Like people are getting very creative. So yeah, I think regardless of what my title was, it was always kind of this kind of hub at the center of the wheel of connecting the analysts with Wizard with the players, or connecting the coaches and connecting like the kind of different groups of information to each other, which was actually really nice because, again, one of the things at Palantir was they have this saying that they say they only hire engineers. And the role that I was in was like a special role where they said, you know, the engineers will focus on engineering. And this one specific role that I was in gets to be the one that interfaces with the customer and has to do all of the translation and the kind of blending of those two pools and the kind of the sales with the product side. And that's basically what I'm doing here. I think the nice thing about where I am is I'm perfectly sitting between the competitive team and the business side. And I think if I went any more onto the business side, I wouldn't be particularly excited about my job. And I think if I went any more into the competitive side, I don't know that I would be like the most effective version of myself, because like we talked about, like I'm not the best player. Like I think I'm good at the game and I understand the game, but I'm not going to be able to look at how Decay is playing Tracer and suggest something novel to him. Like it's just not my skill set.
Right. Did you ever do like micro macro analysis in that regard, and that you provided to the team then?
A little bit, yeah. So early on, when I was working with Wizard, it was very specific things, and so we were really careful with how we came to the players with information, because a lot of players really like, they know that they're very good and they don't necessarily want to be told to do something differently. So if I did come to a player, so like one of the things that we worked on was Meko with his use of the Diva ult, not just to remech. Like he had one of the worst ratios in the league at the time of using the Diva bomb ineffectively, like not even just to get kills, but to create space. He would just kind of sit there and use it. And that kind of became almost the meta, like at the time, is everyone was just using the Diva bomb to remech. And so if you can say to a player, you know, like I can't tell you how to play Diva better, but I've watched you use the Diva ult 200 times, and like I've watched it for like 2 weeks, chances are like I probably know how you're using it better than you do. And it was the same with JJANU's Transcendence usage was very poor, one of the worst in the league. And then his flank timing was very, very good, but we thought it could get better. So that's kind of how we chose to have me interact with, ultimately with Wizard, because of the language gap, and then with the players, was saying, okay, I can't on like the macro sense say like this is, I understand the game better than you, but we can narrow down to something so small that me watching it nonstop for 2 weeks gives me the chance to like get better at it or understand it better than a player might.
What's interesting about this statistics approach is like sometimes we got a little bit of a glimpse into how these spreadsheets look like, and like the type of data that was collected. Mm-hmm. Like having been more on the Winston Slap side, where we sort of like automated all of that, it was interesting to see that you guys relied a lot on manual evaluation also of the specific situations. Was that, do you think, were they like hard defined ways in order to decide what, if this was a 1 or a 0 in terms of like, was this a good flank, a bad flank, or whatever type of information you wanted to track?
I think we usually tried to start there and quickly, and this is, I know one of the things that we'll probably get into, is like how effective is the Moneyball approach in Overwatch. And like my answer now is it's effective in very specific and probably fewer categories than people would normally like want it or think that it is based on its success in other sports. And so a lot of it did come down to us having to define our own categories and having to be very, very careful not to like lead the data, to an outcome that we wanted. And so like one of the things, like I created like my own kind of like category for like how D.Va is played, and this was actually after Wizard had left, and when I was still with NYXL and we were preparing to scout for the next season, I created like a D.Va categorization matrix that kind of said like how the D.Va is played, and like this is the kind of D.Va that Meko plays, the kind of D.Va that we need, and it was based on like a lot of statistics. But this was very much me talking to the coaches and just kind of saying this matters and this doesn't matter, and it was not like we didn't have a baseball level stat. That's the nice thing about like the example of Moneyball is you can say like a 90-mile-an-hour fastball is a 90-mile-an-hour fastball. If you're pitching it to a good batter or a bad batter on a rainy day, it doesn't matter. But like a good D.Va bomb, like it's there's nothing that is like clean about that data. So while I think the automated approach probably allows you to get a lot more data, we were able to make the personal and like the manual one work pretty well because we were able to kind of layer in that context into like, oh, like were they flanking? Like was someone watching them? Like you can't really like get that from a data pull, right?
Yeah.
Like from like say like was someone like did like, and even like not even like watching them, but like intuitive, like did someone know? Like you can just like see how players are like flicking and like checking and saying like, and we would watch to that level and say like, yeah, like this is like a flank where like someone knew, or this is a flank where someone did not know. Which is super manual, questionably useful for the amount of effort it was. But I think it was our average was better than half, I think, in like terms of like generating insights that we were happy with, that we felt good about like giving to a player and trying to use.
Yeah, it's an interesting approach because I think in essence both of these steps were pretty similar in how, for instance, a site like Winston's Lab did it or made it useful to teams. Is you can't do it without the eye test. It sounds like you guys had the eye test as part of the collection, and for the other statistical analysts, it was like, okay, let's see if there's any peculiarities within the data, and then we can look if anything pops up that is out of the ordinary, and then apply the eye test to the same regard. So that it's interesting how this varied. Now, of course, you had a lot of success with NYXL in season 1. Would you base that also on that approach that you had, or do you think these guys were just like already so skilled, so far ahead as a team? What do you attribute it to?
Yeah, I think they were very good. Like I definitely would not look at that season in particular, right? Like we tried to apply a lot of that at the Justice the next year, and it obviously is not something that can just deadlift any roster to success. I think it works really well. And I mean, again, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy in that it works really well with good teams, because when you have a bad team, a lot of the times what you need to fix is obvious. But when you have a good team, like if you look at like a lot of our analysis was actually on JJANU, and at the time, it's like he's the MVP, he's the best player in the league. Like, why are you focusing on and like how do you look at him and say like, oh, this is how you play this better? But there's actually like a good amount of information that like was being passed along to him to help kind of keep that momentum. So I think that's probably where it was. Like I think like NYXL would have been in the tier like that they were, just based on the not just the skill level, but also like the history that they had as a team. I think a lot of people undervalue like how long it takes for a team to properly mesh. That's another lesson that the Justice learned, and that we're hoping this is like the last season where we're going to have to see a rebuild and you lose those gains. But yeah, I think that really helped NYXL, and then yeah, like the analysis that we were able to do just kind of honed that edge a little bit more and kind of was able to make them that much more competitive, like plus or minus some percentage in the more difficult to win games.
What was it like working for them?
It was a very well managed team. I think Rohit and Farzam understood how to run an Overwatch team. They had like various experiences looking at like investment into like high growth categories, and they just like understood. I mean, you can see NYXL in their like not just how the team was built, but also in their marketing and their brand strategy and all of that. It's just really, really clean, and like they're just great at that. I think part of the reason that I wasn't interested in staying at the time was the overwhelming majority of my interactions with the team went through Wizard. And because of the language barrier and the location barrier, because I lived in New York for a little bit. I don't love New York City to live in. I love it to visit, but it's just not me for where I want to live. So if I'm limiting myself in not being in New York, not speaking the language of the team, because they've continued to be a full Korean team, I questioned my own effectiveness. And so at the time, I think it was a great foot in the door. I got to learn a lot from Wizard, got to learn a lot from Rohit and Farzam even. But I think I knew around the time I was getting ready to leave that like my growth there was going to be limited. And I didn't really let it get to the point of it being like a frustration, because I still think I was learning a lot up until I left. But I think if I'd been there another year, it wouldn't have been a service to New York or me, because I think I would have just like hit a ceiling on you can only be so effective when you're not speaking or living with the players.
Did you apply to the Justice independently, or did you and Wizard kind of knew you wanted to work together going forward?
A little bit of both. So I did apply independently. I think I was the last coach hired to the Justice, even after most of their roster had been set. I had been negotiating with New York, and ultimately the direction they wanted me to go in, because I think they also realized the limited nature with which I could interact with the team without Wizard, was they were kind of pushing me into this data analytics role, where they were saying, like Andbox is going to be this growing product. We need to do a lot of like data collection in Overwatch and outside of it. And that was exciting. But the answer that I kind of came up with was, if I wanted to do cool tech stuff in a growing industry, I wouldn't have left Palantir. Like that's what I did there. Right. So I looked at a couple different teams. But I also, like, at the time, my resume was still very thin. This was still my first esports opportunity. So Wizard made it very clear that like he could not just give me the job, but he was able to put in a good word and say like, yeah, like I worked with this guy. He's capable of like contributing positively to a team, which goes a long way. Like in the esports industry, I have hired and fired enough people to know that like just passing the eye test of like having someone that was like, oh yeah, like I worked with them and they were normal and they were
right,
like productive. Like there's value there. There's a lot more value there in esports than there was in my past career.
Right. Makes sense.
So, yeah.
So the job description changed technically. Did the job change? Did you do anything different in terms of the things that you did for the NYXL and then for the Washington Justice initially?
A little bit. So it changed, I think, in proportion with how Wizard's job changed. So and I know he's like mentioned this in a couple of interviews, but he grew a ton as a person in that season. I think he is extremely good at focusing on the micro of the game, and also just like in life, at least like finding a skill and learning it. Like he taught himself English. He's just like very, very good at that. But I think it took him most of that season to realize that like the macro, not just in the game macro, but outside of the game, and like building team synergy and like building that is something that falls under the category of the head coach. And I think that he was optimistic that he could just brute force like solutions by being an extremely smart, extremely strategic head coach. And it took some time to kind of get to a better place, which I think he is now. I think he contributed a lot with Seoul. But similarly, my role kind of slowly shifted, where at the beginning of the season, we still had analysts that were working with us. So I was still managing this analyst pool. But then as better, it also kind of went hand in hand with better review resources, right? Coming out from Blizzard, all of a sudden, less and less we needed to rely on this analyst pool. So I started working more and more with the other coaches, and working on, I think our coaches were relatively inexperienced. And so a lot of times didn't have, they were able to kind of like put analysis together, but weren't necessarily able to get it to the players properly. So it was still like that same role of just kind of like being like the tweener, like in between like players and coaches, in between coaches and management. And actually with coaches and management, that ultimately is how I ended up becoming the assistant general manager, was when Kate decided to step down. They recommended to our owners that I step in and take that spot. Because I actually ended up working a fair amount with Kate at the very, very end as well, when they knew, I think, that they were kind of on their way out.
Was that a personal decision? Did you did you always want to pursue that direction, or was it just a logical conclusion from the situation?
Not when I first joined. Like not when I first got into esports. I think coach, like I still had this like Greg Popovich, like I will be this great. I think like head coach was still like my goal.
Right.
And it was in that season with the Justice, when like I saw kind of management tasks slipping through the cracks and feeling good about stepping in and saying like, oh, I've done this before. Like I know how to do this. That kind of changed my career goals to, oh, I would actually be much better at managing a team than coaching one. And so, yeah, it helped that, yeah, like that we were a team that was struggling, I think, in that category. And so like, as we were like, a lot of what I was doing was player scouting, at the end of my time with NYXL and through like the struggles that we had with the Justice, and we knew we had to like make roster changes. I felt really comfortable connecting with other teams and like making those connections with Supreme that eventually resulted in the connection I have with him now. And doing, yeah, a lot of the kind of like behind the scenes stuff. So again, I feel like I'm just like all the questions you're giving me. You're saying A or B, and I'm like A and B every time.
No, that's just, if it is like this, then it is like this, right?
Yeah.
I want to go a little bit back and really focus on like the beginnings of that season, because we're coming from season 1. Boston has surprised everyone. We all thought they would be one of the worst teams, ended up being one of the best teams. We didn't really know who to attribute it to. In hindsight, there's one man that we can attribute it to now. It's likely Krusty, right? But also the scouting that they did. And there was this idea, it almost became like a buzzword for a lot of it. And I remember also a lot of teams reaching out to statistical analysts and trying to sign them. And it was, of course, Moneyball that was being thrown around and sort of like the next thing to unlock. And of course, you guys sort of started out with the Moneyball guy in the scene. What was really behind the Moneyball approach? Did you really live it to the definition that we would see from baseball, for instance, or was there a different interpretation of that specific term?
No, yeah, it was definitely different. I think it's like cool and sexy to, you know, pretend that we're Brad Pitt telling the old school baseball guys like, no, we know how to make a baseball team.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest difference for us is probably that we were using it for player improvement much more than scouting. And at least in the time that I was there. So again, like I wasn't with the Justice yet at the beginning of their inaugural season, but like I was close enough with Wizard, kind of understood his methods enough that like stats obviously mattered, but it wasn't like we were going in there saying like, oh, we'll pick some diamond in the rough from like some ladder players just because we can look at their KD percentage and some certain thing and we'll like make up, oh, we feel like this many kills per fight, so we'll like attribute those kills in like the Oakland A's style of we need this many runs, so we can, instead of having one player that can get 4 runs, we'll get 2 average players that can get 2 runs, and we'll make it up that way. So I think a lot more of our statistical analysis went into player growth than it did into player scouting. There were a couple tools that we used player scouting wise that I think were helpful at getting from like the huge swath of players down to like a tryout group. But very rarely in my experience do you get from like a tryout of like 4 exceptional players and then use some statistical methodology to figure out which of those 4 is the best. Like at that point, like you're running scrims and it's the eye test and it's your coaches picking someone more so than it is saying, oh, this person averages 0.3 more kills with this alt against this composition.
Right. And then of course, like season 2 happened in the sense that I think initially a lot of people were skeptical of goats. And didn't like there were these ideas that it wasn't going to stick around a lot, and you had to build a team in some way, right? Was that sort of like the Black Swan event that sort of like broke the season? Because we saw as soon as you got out of goats, you actually had pretty good performances.
Yeah, and I think what it highlighted is what continued to cripple the Justice for the beginning of season 3, and that we finally fixed at the end of season 3. Which is that goats more so, like what crippled us, I think, in goats more so than any of our individual players being good at the roles, was that goats was just a team synergy meta. It was just everybody being on the same page, just being insanely good at tracking cooldowns and knowing like when things were going to be happening and just playing together as a team. And we were at the time one of the worst playing together as a team rosters in the league, both for the fact that we were one of the few mixed rosters and then chose to continue to be one of the few mixed rosters, that we were one of the newest rosters, so we didn't have like a lot of that experience under our belt, and also had one of the newest coaching staffs. Very little experience, very little synergy. I think that really crippled us. I think that like at the individual skill level, and that's what worked for us in stage 4 was, and that's not to say that like there was no coaching or no management. I think that there is a management and coaching style that allows you to put yourself in situations that when the meta allows you, your team can perform very well. So like you can pick the players like Corey and Stratus that have that upside potential. But yeah, like the problem with the GOATS meta was it just wasn't what like the team had been built for, and it went for a long time. and there's something to that, right? So I think the criticism that we could take from that is we also did a poor job of getting the team on the same page in that period, right? Like some of that was probably because there was an eye towards, surely this will be the last stage of GOATS and we will be able to fall back on Corey being just a freak at aiming and like synergy between like certain roles that we scouted for, and then it ended up going longer than we thought. So there's definitely like blame to go around there. But yeah, I think the big lesson, and probably one of my biggest regrets from that season, was that we didn't fully learn the lesson of how important team synergy was. And we had to like relearn that lesson a little bit in season 3, which was frustrating. But I think we're there now. We finally learned.
I mean, one of the synergies that were pretty openly discussed was between Elevote and LullSiSH. Sadly, that never came to be. What was? Can you talk about the complications of the visa process there?
Yeah, it's not the specifics. So like we've spoken with our lawyers and also with LullSiSH about that, and ultimately the visa process is like very personal. So it's difficult to kind of get into the details of that without kind of talking about things that I would rather not share. But it's also just like the process itself is very arbitrary. Like it's really not, it's always like this big juicy thing, right? It's like we had, so at Palantir, we had to get clearances for all of our engineers. And we had this joke that like you could kill someone, but you're not allowed to travel to China, because we would have people with like very checkered past that would get clearances. But if you went to China as like a 2-year-old, like 30 years ago, wow, you don't get your clearance. Like you're never going to get it. And so it's a similar thing with LullSiSH. Just he got unlucky, and we put. Oh man, he was so patient. He was just like, wait. I think Grant and I both tweeted out that he was just like the model player. Like we had like lawyers that were trying to refile, and we put a ton of work. And the whole time he was just like, yeah, like I'll participate in scrims. Like I'll do what I can from here. I truly wish him the best. I really hope that he can bounce back, because he's a great player. We were so excited, and that's like those are the only players that I really signed in that season. And even kind of going to the next season, we're like Elevote and LullSiSH, and that was me saying, yeah, like synergy matters. We're going to get these guys that have pre-existing synergy, because we as a team we're not great at building it yet. And then we couldn't even get that. So that was rough.
Yeah, very true. What were your expectations like coming into this into the league? What kind of placement did you want to achieve, and what would you have been satisfied with?
Like season 2 or 3?
Season 2.
Or season 2. That's a good question. I'm trying to think if there like that conversation. I'm sure like there's obviously like we can win it all, we can be the best, and then you start scrimming, you start looking at your players, and you kind of have that recalibration of, okay, like what do we actually have, and what can we do with the hand we've been dealt. I think we held on to the playoff dream for a while. For a while, we were saying like, we can still like grit this out, and we can turn this into like a top 10, top 8 team, like with an outside chance at the playoffs. Especially when there was definitely a moment where we kind of thought that we had figured out like a GOATS playstyle that worked for us. And that was like a little bit different than how everyone else was playing it, but it played a little bit more to our strengths. Didn't end up working out. But I think that, for most of that season, we had a bit of a pipe dream that like we had an outside shot at the playoffs. And we really didn't.
Right. I mean, you came into stage 4 and the meta change really changed everything for you guys. Like finally, Corey was able to aim. I think it was pretty public how picked apart his Zarya was. So I'm sure it must have felt great for him to be finally able to show the skill set. What was the experience like finally being able, like from, I believe, the last team in the season rankings to then have that stage 4? What was it like?
It was very much like a revelation, and that's when I look at the decisions that I'm making now as a general manager. Like I learned so much in that stage that it is like that like it or not, the way the league is it is a any given meta, any given week kind of league. And they're like, yeah, you could take this team that everyone would look at and say, wow, this team is terrible, and then make some changes, and all of a sudden we are like arguably like a top 2 team in the league for a couple of weeks. Like we were playing extremely well, and so like that I took that to heart instantly. That's also when I felt like I learned a lot about like the team synergy. We had this opportunity where like the shot callers changed, where like the leadership roles changed. I think the team was a lot more cohesive. In GOATs, we had the issue where nobody was confident, so the kind of shot caller mantle got passed around way more than it should have. And when you have players that are just doing very well, it's a lot easier to say, okay, like we will follow this person's plan. And I think in a lot of my kind of streams and interviews, I've been very vocal that like my biggest kind of like pre-ism, if you will, for Overwatch is there are 10 correct plans, but the team that wins is the one that's on the same page. And we fell into that trap season 3, the beginning of the season as the Justice, and we fell into that trap all through GOATs. We'd have 6 plans and they were all correct, but we just had to commit to one of them. And what we could do in stage 4 was that we were able to actually start committing to plans properly. And that worked really well. So yeah, I think, I personally learned a lot. I think we as a team learned a lot. So super, super valuable. Didn't learn a lot fast enough that we were able to keep that going immediately into season 3. But then that was like the final reinforcement of like, okay, we know what we're doing wrong now. And I'm hoping that we don't end up in that kind of place again.
So you say teams being on the same page is pretty much like synonymous with being a good team in the respective metas. How much does a meta have to do with teams being on the same page then?
I think you can put teams into tiers into like how much of the same page they're on. And when you get to a certain tier, like the shock tier, it doesn't matter, right? Like you can throw any meta and they just understand each other and their play styles and how they're going to play as a team so well, it doesn't matter. Like I don't think anybody was sitting there seeing shock on the schedule the next week saying, oh, I hope that we get the meta that breaks the shock. Like it just wasn't going to happen. But there's definitely this kind of like meat of like center of the bell curve of teams in terms of synergy, where it would fall apart. Like if your synergy is based on the performance of one player, right? If your synergy is based on Yaki or a Sparkle just popping off on Genji, then there is kind of a meta-ness to your team synergy, if you will. So yeah, I think it can be trumped. I think that's a lot of what we built this team for this roster going into the next season is I don't think we ever, if ever, we very rarely sat down and said like, okay, like these are the metas, right? Like there's rush, there's dive, there's double shield. Let's build a roster that is good at these metas. It was way, way more conversation about like, let's just make a roster that will play well together, and then we'll just take the metas as they come.
Right. You've been in the position sort of from the framing of how it happened. First, you were not that good. Then a meta change comes in. Then you get on the same page. Then you win. Now it looks like, and I just wrote 10,000 words power rankings, but it looks like you guys will be in a very different position, meaning that most of the time you will probably be consistently one of the top teams. And then what happens, or how do you think about the game if, let's say, in the last stage or even in the playoff patch, something breaks where, for instance, an important player towards your team synergy that keeps it together is no longer on the correct heroes that he requires in order to play? How do you cope with that as a team that has aspirations to be one of the best in the league.
We just watched like the replays from last season. Hey, we wrote it last season, so we'll take it this season now. Yeah, I think it's hard, right? It's very hard, and I think it's something that from like the Owl perspective, if there was a complaint from the team to Blizzard, the response is, just like build a flexible team. Like this is not an esport where you should be building a team that is inflexible. That's just foolish, right? That would be like the official response. The issue that I have with that is because I'm straddling this interesting position where I also kind of have a foot on the business and investor side. I would be very skeptical as an investor to be told like, oh, you should spend X dollars on these players, but we might make a change that makes them useless. No promises. Like that's a really, really hard position to be putting people in. So yeah, I mean, like, is there a chance that like we do well and then like there's a change to the game and we do very poorly? Yes, but I think that because we're in this position where, as you said, we were on the opposite side of it, I think that really conditioned us to almost ignore like the whole concept of like building for metas and just say like, listen, we're just going to make a team that is good and happy to play together. And I guess like the last thing that I would say is the thing that really worked well for us in stage 4 and towards the end of this season. And I think one of the coaches at Philly mentioned this at the beginning of season 3 was like, it's impossible to undervalue how much it helps to win.
Yes.
And how much it gets everybody on the same page. And so going into like, if that situation were to happen to us, I think that there is a some X multiplier for teams that are winning and are comfortable winning and know how to win together. But yeah, like if you do end up losing in a meta that didn't work for you, again, like I'm not the person to ask for this, but like what I want to say is like that's kind of your fault, right? Like It's like you had the time, you had the wins, you had just the chance to like stretch your legs and maybe like get some confidence in a mid-season tournament, and if a meta comes and your coaches can't adapt to it and your players who have shown that they're capable can't keep up, maybe that's on you. But we'll see. Like maybe we'll have an interview after and I'll just be angry and be like, they can't keep doing this. They can't keep changing the meta before the playoffs.
Sure.
Yeah, for now, I think, there's a lot of responsibility on teams to know that this has now happened multiple times and say like plan for it and kind of build a team that can survive that.
The problem with the building to survive that is that, okay, some teams are pretty close to the roster max once again, Shanghai, Spark and everything. In order to be truly able to see any meta coming and then play that one, either you have extremely flexible players and only have 7. It's probably very hard to achieve. Or you have a larger roster. So, especially with the meta volatility induced by hero pools, how are these 7-man rosters going to cope? And what's the responsibility like? What's the process like? How do you even prepare for all of this?
Yeah, I think 7-man rosters are going to have a really hard time. Coming as a team that had a 7-man roster for the majority of last season, we would walk into metas, find out what the meta was midweek, and just say, we can't. Like we have to make a subtle change. We have to do something different, or just say, you know what, we will play it because like any changes that we can make just make us instantly inferior. And so you just hope that like it feels very deflating because it does feel like it takes a good amount of skill out of the game. Like it feels like it's kind of putting this element of randomness, and these are the same complaints that everybody's had, since the hero ban system came into place. Is does it lower the overall skill cap? Does it lower like the quality of play in the league? So yeah, I think 7-man rosters are going to have a hard time. The way that I would say is kind of best to approach that as a team that's going to have a smaller roster size is like, one, obviously like the cheap answer is just like have flexible players, right? Sign Mag. He can play every main tank at an insanely high level. And so that's one route. And then the other route is realistically, if we had not kind of if we had not been successful in our off-season signings, saying like, you know what, there's just gonna be metas where we suck, and build a team forward-looking enough to say the meta is going to change this many times. We will eat it in one meta, but we will have a good enough performance and team for the others that we can qualify for the playoffs and have an upshot at getting lucky. And I think that's probably that's probably the responsible way to go about having a min roster. Is just saying that the goal is not to be competitive all the time. The goal is that when the right cards come up, we can do well.
I kind of want to dial back because it sort of feeds into this point. So your seasons really come in waves if you think about it. So it's the wave comes at the end most of the time, or both times. And what's it like? So I imagine through season 2, you have a pretty good explanation of saying, okay, it was GOATs. We kind of got it now. 6-1 in the last stage, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
We figured it out. You get into season 3, and you find out you might have not understood it.
Yeah.
An interesting concept that I've heard from the Mayhem specifically, who also had a little bit of a redemption arc, is this idea of learning to win again. Did you feel like maybe that wasn't entrenched enough in the players, and just like maybe had you won more in the early stages of the season, your season could have gone very differently?
In season 2, absolutely. And I think in season 2 specifically, because the meta didn't change, that like once you didn't know how to win in GOATs, like I said, like we had like these moments where like scrimbucks and whatever in a week where we would think that we had it figured out, and we'd be like, okay, this is working. Like we're finally turning this around, and then we would just get stomped like that weekend, just like the last weekend. And I think absolutely in that period, 100%, like you have to learn how to win again. One of the nice things about the hero bans and the meta changes, right, is you kind of get this artificial influx of it's a new week, it's a new month, it's a new meta, who knows? And so I don't think that I would not look at season 3 for us and say, oh, we forgot how to win. I think there were just like bigger issues that we had in season 3, particularly on like team synergy and everyone getting along, that also kind of came out in season 2, and that we are, I think, really successfully able to address that correlated well towards the end of the season with us turning things around. But I wouldn't look at season 3 and say, yeah, like we forgot how to win. I think we were just playing and just being poor teammates. would be my diagnosis of the situation.
Okay, poor teammates and like a challenging situation is an interesting keyword, because you guys once again went through a major managerial like changing process, and you took over as the general manager. What was the atmosphere and everything like when you took over?
I think everyone was ready for change. I think a lot of people have been kind of pushed to the limit of trying to cooperate with people that they didn't agree with. There were on the coaching level, I think we had, again, the same issue of a lot of really good ideas, but like too many good ideas and too few times the same good ideas. And so with Corey going into Valorant and Stratus going into content creation, it gave us this opportunity to like blow up a lot of the team and say like, okay, we know that like our biggest issue is a team that is not at some point like is either incapable or just not choosing to play together, be that for language barrier, for cultural reasons, for different people wanting to kind of be like the person like not necessarily shot calling, like not shot calling in the sense of like how we call, like how esports people refer to shot calling, but the one like calling the shots, the one being like, oh, this is how we're going to play, right? Like IGL form of stuff. And so when we were able to rebuild the team, we stripped it down a lot, and we stripped it down to a smaller roster with, I think, a much more, and the same with our staff, and just a much more kind of hierarchical, simple kind of, this is the way we're going to build a team, this is the way we're going to play the game structure that was like night and day. And that's why we're building a similarly kind of sized staff, similarly sized roster, similarly monocultural roster for next year, because I think that was like the big mistake. That was the underlying mistake in season 2. That was the big mistake in season 3. And we're not going to make that mistake again. Like, I'm not going to make that mistake again. I hate making the mistake twice. Like, it killed me in season 3 when I figured out, like, oh man, this is the same thing. Because you think it's other things. You think it's like, oh, like maybe we didn't pick up the right people. Maybe like this is wrong. I was like, no, it's literally just people aren't getting along. Right. And that was frustrating.
Now, Corey was a major player for you guys. And
yeah,
like he was, for his character, pretty vocal at the time about the retirement. Do you have a good idea why he retired? And would you have liked to continue with both Corey and Stratus going forward if it had not retired?
Yeah, so I think it's one of those things like everyone wants there to be a bigger story behind it. And as I said, like I'm not going to say there wasn't turmoil going on in the background, and there was. But like when Valorant first came out, outside of like Corey even looking at it as a game, it's built for him. Like he was this CS:GO aim god that like has such good mechanical ability, and he came over into Overwatch, and when he was able to play the heroes that complemented that skill set was great. But now he's in this world where on any given week, maybe he gets put on Zarya, maybe he gets put on Mei, maybe he doesn't get to use his best skill set. And then like Valorant is like the new hotness. It's produced by Riot. They have some like changes to it that are like Overwatch-esque. Like it was just like a perfect match for him. So I think if the team had been doing well, best case scenario, he sticks out through the end of the season and then goes to Valorant. But like I honestly think that game is like very close to his calling. And I think he felt the same way. So yeah, I think him going to that made a lot of sense for him. If we could go back and do it again, I think Stratus and Corey are both good players, but we needed that wake up call. Like, and frankly, we needed that chance to reset, because if they had stayed through the end of the season, we wouldn't have had this opportunity to just kind of blow everything up. And a lot of people asked me, did you guys choose to go all Korean? And my answer to that was, what we really wanted was to go like one not culture, but like one, get everyone on the same page, right? And so if it was something where like Roar and like Aim God had left, and we had this majority Western team, and also if you look at like the free agents, if one of the biggest Western teams broke up and all of a sudden all of their players were available for like no buyout fees, then surprise, we would have been a Western team, and maybe we would have gone in like a different coaching direction that supported that. But it just so happened that when Corey and Stratus left, when the team was starting to restructure, a lot of our Western talent left. We believed in a lot of the Korean players and Korean coaches that we had at the time, and there were some great Korean free agents. We were like, okay, let's not bang our head against the how do you make a mixed team roster work wall for another season, and let's go down this path.
Yeah, the sort of coincidental implosion of both of your like the Titans and your roster a little bit delayed actually opened an interesting opportunity. Now, you kind of have a reputation at that point that you're one of the lesser performing teams, especially like someone like JJANU commands a lot of respect in the league, considered one of the best offtanks. What does it take to convince a guy like that? And then also Stitch.
Yeah, and I think that was like I've had a lot of really lucky turning points in my career that have come at the same time of like really impactful learning lessons. And so the lesson that we learned then is basically the lesson that we use to build the roster for next season. And it was that we were getting to this point where players wanted to be in the league, not to make a ton of money, but because they liked being in the league. Right? Like there's this thing where if you wanted to go and play Valorant, you could go and play Valorant. Like Baby Bay did it, Zachary did it, Ruckus did it, Corey did it. If you wanted to go and like be a streamer, like you can do that. Like Sleepy's a huge streamer. Like there's a lot of different options that you have. So the people, we're getting down to this group of people that are in the Overwatch League because they want to be there. And for those people, all of a sudden it becomes less of, am I getting X amount of money versus like X plus one amount of money? And it's more of, am I going to go to a team where there's not going to be these frustrations of disliking my teammates, where I'm not going to get screwed over by a coach or a management group, where I'm not going to like feel like I'm like not being like put in a good light to my fan base. And there's like a lot of these kind of creature comforts that I think season 2 was probably the worst of it, like money wise. Like that's all anyone cared about, like signing in season 2. And then all of a sudden going into season 3, and especially now going into next season, like with the way that COVID has impacted things, yeah, you can really kind of woo players to your team saying, we're not going to pay you the most. We don't have a great history, like record-wise as a team, but look, like we have like a coaching staff that want to work with you and that get along and that are going to give you like a good opportunity. We have a management group that wants to grow your personal channels and that also importantly has learned these lessons, right? Like I get to like lean on like my failures and say, look, I'm not going to do this to you again. Like I watched this happen and it was awful. Mm-hmm. And so it's not going to happen again. And I can promise you that. Mm-hmm. And there's a, I forget his name now. I don't know how much you follow the NBA, but there was a commentator for the Utah Jazz. They just like signed a big player, Rudy Gobert, and he like had a tweet, and his tweet was like the biggest myth in the NBA is the myth of the rebuild, and like 30% of teams are bad and will forever be bad. They will never be good. And this is in the NBA where they have like this artificial fix in the draft to make bad teams good. Like, we don't have that. Like unless you're going to pay through the nose to like try to get these good players, it is extremely difficult in the Overwatch League to turn your reputation around, even in like these few short years. And so that was like what I saw as that opportunity. How we, in these long conversations with Stitch and JJANU, when we got past like the money hurdle and we got past the like we know we were a bad team hurdle, it was ultimately they wanted to be part of a team like that they were proud of and that they believed in. And that's ultimately why they ended up coming to the Justice. And that's a big part of what we leaned on this offseason was like, you know what? If you really, really want to get paid like X% more, you should probably go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. Like, because somebody else out there will pay you 5% more than we will. They just will. But we know that you came from this team where you didn't believe in like how it was being run. You didn't like the coaching decisions. You didn't like that you were benched all the time. You didn't like, they promised you this and that and the other thing, and they didn't give it to you. Like and that was a huge thing. I was like, talk to our players. I was like an open book. I was like, talk to any of our previous players, and they were already talking to them, like in like their ranked games and whatnot. They'd be like, oh yeah, like I didn't get to go home, I didn't get to do this, and our players were like, oh, that's weird because that never happens to us, and that was huge for us. That was massive that these players could just kind of come into these conversations being like, oh yeah, we know you guys are like reasonable, good people, and we've had enough trying to maximize salary, throwing ourselves into situations where we're not sure if we're going to get taken care of.
Right. I almost see the even just getting Stitch and JJANU for the 14 days as sort of like the turning point in terms of your reputation, because then it has established precedent that you're a destination now for people, and especially if they were then to sign a longer contract, well, that then demonstrates value on your side. So what were those 14 days like? Was there a lot of anxiety involved on your side?
It wasn't too bad. I think that the big thing for us was the initial signing, right? So like I at that point, like I really believed in like the system that we were building, and I was like, if we can get these guys in the door for 14 days, they're not going to want to leave. Like I felt very confident in that, and so it really was trying to convince them like our team sucks, and it just very publicly blew up. And so it was very much trying to get them to believe, like, listen, things are changing, and like you guys are going to be like players like 1 and 2 in this new trend, and getting them on board with that. And Supreme played a huge part in that. Like Supreme, a lot of people don't. I mean, either they know or they don't fully know like how long his tenure has been in esports. How many people trust him because he has historically, time and time again, just been on the correct side of like things that have gone wrong, and he's been like the voice of reason. He's been the one that's been like, we probably shouldn't do that. We should probably do this way, and like that helped us a lot. He was very key in getting JJANU and Stitch to understand like things were changing.
And then, arguably, the next peak that you guys climbed was then getting Decay. Now, that was an interesting one because it was based on the rule change. Very late into the season. How did that process go? How did you contact him, and what was the negotiation like? What was he looking for?
Yeah, so I mentioned this at the time. We had actually been very interested in Decay for a while. We'd actually been speaking with Dallas. We knew that like the fit wasn't perfect there, and we were very interested in bringing him on for his obvious just overall skill, but also we just thought that he fit well into like some of the things we were trying to do with our lineup. So it was another one of those kind of perfect storms where we had already done the scouting. We already knew we wanted him on the team, but it just hadn't worked out with Dallas. And then the teams knew because Blizzard had like told us before the official date that they were going to do this kind of like COVID relief. If you have a player in certain circumstances, you'll be able to sign a new player. So at the time, we didn't know Decay was going to get dropped, but we did know that we were one player away from the min restriction, and it was very unlikely that that player was going to get into the country. So we actually had also started scouting other players and other free agents because in our back of our mind, this is the same time that like the playoff format kind of discussions were happening in the background. And we were like, hey, who knows? Like maybe we're going to get a shot in the playoffs and maybe we'll be able to use this massive like detriment that this for a big chunk of this season, like we talked about, we've been in this minimum roster situation that has been really hard for us. And maybe we can finally turn that into something productive for us. And then it just so happened that, in my opinion, one of the best players in the Overwatch League became one of the people that we could target to use that rule. So, and I obviously, people were not thrilled. There's many different ways we can justify it, like even to the point of would LullSiSH's visa situation have been easier to handle if we were not having to compete with like expats fleeing the country because they didn't want to get locked there for COVID? Probably. We're on thin ice there. So like I understand that like some people were frustrated, but I do think that like hindsight's 2020. Like to your question of like convincing Decay to come here, right? In that same way that we convinced JJANU and Stitch to come here, I think he fell into a similar pattern, right? An org that he was struggling with, that they obviously got to the point that I actually don't know the specifics of like how his contract was terminated early, but he was, according to Dallas, so interested in leaving that he left after the player deadline, which like I know that he was not like, no one really thought about Decay being able to be picked up after that deadline. So he was basically saying, I just won't play the rest of the season. And so he clearly was coming from an org where there were things that were not working. And so this kind of became a pattern for us where we were saying, is there going to be a team that can offer him the moon in salary? Absolutely. But is he necessarily going to want to take that after presumably being paid very well and still saying, I literally just won't play the game? And so I think that's kind of like what worked out for us, was that we are becoming, and we are, I think, that org that is just doing a really good job of taking care of our players.
That was a topic that was kind of like discussed on social media, that you guys probably offered him a large chunk of money. Was it that much?
It wasn't. I can't say the exact number. He wasn't our top paid player, like annualized, right? So like obviously he was there for but like his annualized salary wasn't even in our top 3.
Wow.
So, and I get why that became the narrative, because if I was a GM on a different team and I really wanted to sign that player and our owners were like, why didn't we get Decay? I'd be like, oh man, they must have paid so much, knowing that like whoever got him can't refute it. Or can't like classily refute it, I suppose. And yeah, it's also like I remember on like Kick Tripod, like everyone kind of thought that, because everyone knew he was like the best player,
Right.
or one of the best players.
Yes.
But yeah, I think that JJANU and Stitch were first, right? Decay was next, and even some of the players that we've signed in this offseason, like Mag, Fury, like these really big names that like there are known orgs that if you just want to get paid through the nose, you can go to. There's like 4 orgs that will just have much larger payrolls, in my opinion. Like we don't know exact numbers, but that you can go to. And it's a very early on in the conversation with my players that like I get this out of the way, 'cause like I don't want to waste my time, I don't want to waste their time. And I'm just like, this is what we have to offer. And Decay was on board very, very fast. He was just like, yeah, I get it. This, like, I'm tired of, like chasing whatever else. Like, this is the kind of org I want to be part of.
Do you have to make certain assurances to a player like that? For instance, him having maybe some say in terms of like who you guys are getting or some feedback in that regard? Does he command that type of position?
He didn't, but we like proactively put it out there. So Decay, in my experience, was never in our like negotiations with him, was never someone that kind of like laid down the law. And again, like I know there are players that do this in the league that say like, this is the type of thing I want to be a part of. It was very important to him that we had like a predominantly Korean speaking team and coaches, but we kind of were ahead of that already. And we're like, yeah, we learned that lesson too. Like we're on the same page there. And then with all of our players, like as we're signing them, our tryouts, like we have like our tryout room with all of our players, but then we have like separate conversations rooms with all of our existing players. And again, because we're this team that has learned this lesson the hard way twice on team synergy, we are extremely active and extremely vocal with our players. And like even if someone just like pops off and just mows everybody down in tryouts, they still have to pass like the talking to our team and be like, do you guys want to play with this guy? And again, like, that's something that we like, it's not like written in a contract anywhere. It's just something that we articulated and that I think we still stand by and still actively do. And so like the players, again, like all of the players talk, they're all friends, they're all on their private Discord servers. And so they know like, oh yeah, like the Justice do that. And so you don't have to go in there and say, oh, like I demand this type of like say, and I demand this type of roster makeup, because it's just inherent that with our org, you're going to get to be part of that conversation.
I think another boon is like the way I understand it and follow the offseason is, yes, people want to play with certain people or under certain people in terms of their coaching staff. They also kind of want to win a lot. Now, you guys had a pretty sweet marketing campaign towards that being the case, which was once again the late stages of the Overwatch League last year. Yeah, do you think that was very important in terms of like being able to attract like top tier talent like Mag, that you guys had a great finish in the playoffs?
Oh yeah. So I think and there's I think the other thing that I would add to that list of like things that players are looking for is they also want to play with good players.
Right.
And so obviously, so having Decay, like based on like the circumstances under which we signed him, had to become a free agent, had to be given the opportunity to look at other offers, and other offers came in predictably. But again, it was very similar like those 14 days. I mean, it was longer than the 14 days, but it was very similar to that time frame with JJANU and Stitch, where I was like, if we can get you in the door, you're not going to want to leave. Like, if you come here and you see like what we're about, like, and I wouldn't have even been mad if he left for money, right? If he said, you know what, like this team's going to pay me 4x what you guys are paying me, like I'm out. I would be like, I get it. Like, and honestly, that's for the best, because the players that we're putting on this team, like nobody here wants to be the highest paid player in the league. Everyone here wants to be like well coached, play with good players, and yes, win. Like that is obviously something that matters a lot to us. And to your point with Mag, with Fury, with a lot of the folks that we signed in the off season, I don't know. I don't know if it definitely would have been a much harder conversation if we had not had our playoff run, because something that this offseason has also taught us is that everyone's memories are very short. And so if you take a great player and you put them on a bad team, maybe they don't get picked up the next season.
Yes.
Which is heinous. Mm-hmm. Like absolutely. And so like, so for their own job security, they have to say, like, you guys have to have a chance of turning things around. Because like, if we hadn't showed that like glimmer of like, yes, this new system is working, it would have been a hard sell. It would have been a really hard sell to get some of the players that we did.
Now, if we follow the patterns, right? So you take over, another team in the Overwatch League blows up, you get to gain from that. Another team has an issue with a top tier player, you get to gain from that. And then, because everything is crazy into 2020, you get to play in the playoffs. Is your redemption arc sort of like being the anti-fragile organization that stands to gain from chaos? So that's the theme of your rebuild?
I think so. I talked a lot with Grant when we were rebuilding the team, and so like a lot of my job is like pitching players and pitching ideas to Grant, and we have like I think it feels very much like a like startup room where he's like this angel investor with the money, and I'm just like sitting there like trying to like figure out this is how we're gonna do it. And I think the favorite conversation that we always come back to is this phrase of it's like a puncher's or like a fighter's chance, right? Like in boxing, like if you have someone that is like probably not going to win, but they just have like some like a really good left hook and like it's just like they just luck into it, then they get like some like small bump in their like odds because it's like, like he probably shouldn't win, but like, hey, maybe. And I think that by building a team that way, as things get more chaotic, like the value of making that team goes way up, right? So like if I would have been like frustrated if I had spent a ton of money to build this incredibly good team and then things get chaotic and this kind of goes like into our meta conversation, right? And you build like this like the best possible team and then things get chaotic and then you don't finish as well as you should have. But again, like I guess my response to that is like at what point do you have to realize that the Overwatch League is just going to be a chaotic place? And so the way like you just have to sit there and you just have to kind of like stay in the pocket and like like things are like oh like half my org gets like ripped apart, COVID happens, like all these things you have to just say that and it's like oh but like Decay just became available and I'll pick him up and like oh JJANU and Stitch and I think that is a big part of like why we're successful is because we are not I think the org that we have right now is not easily swayed or kind of thrown off course by like the chaos that's happening. I think that we got like criticized by the leagues. We got Stitch and JJANU here so fast that other teams were trying to sign Vancouver players, and they were like, "How? Like the visa transfers?" They're like, "How did you do that?" And I was like, we just didn't sleep. We were just like, bang, 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 like go. And it was the same with like the Decay situation. Like we had everything. Like as soon as like all of the rules fell into place, like I'm sure other teams were having conversations about like the money and like would it fit and like does it make sense for the playoffs? And we were so ready when it happened. And because that has paid off for us a couple of times now, we are very much that team that like when things start to hit the fan, like we are just waiting, just saying, okay, like how can we make this work for us?
Right. Now, of course, you also signed players the ordinary way. Nothing had to break for you guys to get Mag. So what was the process like there?
So Mag was we knew Mag was like very, very he was we knew we wanted him like first. And he was like our first pick. I know that's true for many teams, but this also goes back to like other lessons that we learned, right? We really didn't want to split out the main tank role. That's something that we feel like we were learning that you need like your main tank is just so much of the anchor of your roster that if you're not getting the consistency of having them in every scrim, every rep, every match, you're putting yourself in a really bad position. So we knew we wanted someone that could do that. We knew Mag was one of the only players in the league that can do that. And he also had like the right mentality. We've every time I feel like you go to like the whiteboard, you start writing out main tanks. You have to like make the tiers of their skill and then make the tiers of like the baggage that's coming with the main tank. It's like, oh, there's like this main tank, but he's a booster. There's this main tank, but he's toxic. There's this main tank, but he's like this. And it's just like, it's a really, really hard role. And Mag just fit this perfect spot of he does everything that we want. He doesn't have any weird bad history. He has this awesome pedigree. We have talked to a ton of people he's played with on Runaway and elsewhere, and everyone just has good things to say about this guy. And we also, because we knew he was going to be so attractive to so many people in the off season, it carried with what we talked about earlier. Like we have Decay and we have Mag, and now we get to put this as another kind of source of ammo in our conversations. Don't you want to come play with Mag and Decay? Right.
Right.
Like, yeah. So like that was really, really important to us. So we put a lot of effort into scouting, and I say scouting, not scouting to say like, oh, like Mag's a good player, because obviously he's a good player. But I think this was like Steph Curry. I think that Steph Curry leaked that like Nike came to him with a deal and they just gave him like the rubber stamp, like come be a Nike athlete. And then Under Armour came to him and they had like pulled up his highlights from high school and they knew like everything about him. and he chose Under Armour, and it literally is like what created the basketball brand at Under Armour, because it didn't exist before they signed Steph Curry.
Right.
And so similarly, like there's scouting to know when a player is good, and then there's scouting to recruit a player. Like we scouted to recruit Mag. Like we really, really wanted Mag on the team.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like the weird thing is that theoretically last season, so I remember the official date when a player was too young to be signed, so the cutoff date was like 2 days before Mag turned 18. So we assumed he is just good enough to even get attention at that point. Do you have any idea why that didn't happen already during season 3?
Yeah, I think he really enjoyed playing with Runaway. I think that there were reasons. Like I haven't sat down and like talked to him too much about it, but from the conversation that I had with him for when we talked for his recruitment, like he really enjoyed being with that org. And again, like this comes down to we're getting into this timeline where maybe money or even being in the Overwatch League isn't like the number one thing. It's like he was playing with an incredible roster that, similar to like the Vancouver like pickup org, you could have just was playing at a high enough level that you could just slap them into the Overwatch League and they would have done well. And so he's having a good time playing with people that he believes in, winning tournaments and doing well. So I haven't asked him specifically about that, but that would be my guess, is that like he was happy with that situation and ready to kind of, similar to like college athletes, right? You see like some college athletes in basketball, which is my go-to metaphor, right? They're like, they probably could have like declared for the draft, but they're like, give it one more year, like go out, like go give it a run in a championship, stick it out one more time, and then go to the big time.
Now, my brain has just processed the previous answer, which was quite interesting. I wonder, like you mentioned, okay, I think we won't have to convince many people listening to this that Mark is possibly the rookie coming into the next season. I think a lot of people understand his value. The other scouting, as in trying to understand the player and what makes him want to join you, that's what I'm interested in. Are there any details you can share, like the arguments that you felt convinced Mark to join the Justice?
Yeah, I mean, I try to be very literal and like not hide things with players. And so while we did do like we did look into things that he like that he was looking for in an org, like I also like sat down with him, and like we have a translator who I love. His name is Amsong, and he is extremely good at, I think, conveying like tone. And so like a lot of times, like I really trust him to kind of get across the meaning that I have. And it helps a lot when you're being very direct, because I think things can come across weird if it comes across as I say like, what do you want? Like I've had like long conversations with most of the players that we brought in saying like, rank for me the priorities of like what you care about in the league, all the things that we've talked about, playing with like other good players. And again, like plot spoiler, a lot of people want to play with Decay. Like Decay has a very, very good reputation in the league, both for his own skill, but also for being someone that like just feels good to play with, because they are good enough at their role that like they make you better and whatnot. So like if players are kind of slow to respond or they don't really have like an immediate answer, I like lay out like, okay, like listen, these are the 10 things that people tell me that they care about. Like money, winning, playing with good people, being on an all-Korean team, being in the US, being in a major city, having coaching staff that they believe in, being able to like go home to Korea at regular intervals. Like there's like like having business class flights. Like there's a whole there's a menagerie of things. And I don't know how many other teams are doing that. Like are sitting down. I think a lot of teams are probably oversimplifying this, and honestly think they can just win by putting the bigger number out there. And we are one of those teams, and like, we have that in the first conversation, and then over the like coming weeks, if they said something like, "Oh, I really like what's a good example?" I don't have a great example off the top of my head, but if someone like says something and it's something that like in a couple weeks I can move the needle on, if it's like, oh, I really want to be like walking distance to my facility. Like I hated having to metro to my thing. If we are like choosing between a couple facilities and all of them are within a 5-minute walk, I'll like make a nice little map for them. And I'll be like, look, these are the 3 apartments. These are like the things that we're looking at. And like, I can guarantee you we're going to be in one of them and they're all walking distance.
Right.
Like little things like that, where it's just like, I do think that in particular, when there's a language barrier, it is hard. It can be hard for there to be trust. And so I think by like showing that we can go above and beyond on the things that they care about, and that we're even asking about the things that they care about, helped a lot with how we were recruiting.
It's an interesting subject, because the first thing that pops to mind with like really unique requirements that some esports contracts have, I sadly forget where it came up, but there was something about a coffee machine being part of the
I remember that too. Yeah.
I feel like it's Valiant. I'm not 100% sure, but yeah. So is there, without having to name the either if it's a coach or a player, is there anything like a weird little quirk where you're like, I guess you want that? Like, okay, I'm going to make that happen. Is there anything like this?
Nothing weird. I would be so down just to do like weird, like, if it was something like that, because it also like shows like that's so disproportionately valuable, right? Like a $200 coffee machine gives way more than $200 of value in contract negotiations and showing like that you're willing to go above and beyond for a player. But no, I think we don't have anything weird. Everything we've done has been like within that realm of like, yeah, kind of like that list of things that I mentioned, and saying like, oh, like I like having a gym that I can work out in. Oh, like we have like that right there. Oh, I have like very specific, like some players. One thing was, and just again, like nobody made their decision based on this, but like a couple players mentioned to us that like they hated their setups, right? Like they were like at these teams and they had these like flimsy, crappy desks, and they were like crowded into a room. So we actually contracted these same desk manufacturers that built the desks for the stage at the Blizzard Arena, and we spent like $20,000 building custom fabbed like aluminum desks that like you could use as like parking things, like cars would run into, and be like those videos where like the car flips over it and the desk is still standing there. Like these things are awesome.
Right.
It's like little things like that. People are like, oh yeah, like I hate that like I don't feel like I'm achieving my potential as a player because I have a bad setup, and I'm like, we have like the coolest desk I've ever seen.
Yes.
And it's like little things like that. And like and those have definitely paid off like instantly. It's like what? It's like, yeah, like 20K is a lot of money, but like some people are probably spending like 5K on like bad desks, and then they're breaking and they're replacing them, and then that's the other thing. These contracts are pretty big, and so if like one player just like takes like a small decrease to play for your team because you've articulated that you care enough about their performance and their quality of life to make this investment, it's like a no-brainer.
One thing, you kind of listed down the priorities of the things that players in your experience seem to value. Now, one particular change coming in the contract structure in the Overwatch League is that theoretically teams, or rather players and teams, can negotiate the possibility of parting ways within 30 days. Is safety something that players in your experience desire a lot in terms of these contract durations?
It varies. I think it varies mostly based on like how bullish or bearish a player is on their own performance, and also like based on their right, like they're like, oh, I'm so good, like you're never gonna want to drop me, so I don't care. Or also based on their past experience, right? Like if they've been screwed over by an org that like dropped them in a like unreasonable way, they're gonna have a little bit of that like gun shy, like
right.
I love everything that you're promising to me, but I'd love to have it on paper. And so so that's like part of the negotiation that we've had with everyone. I think that one of the things that again works to our favor, and another example of kind of the Justice as an org really trying to leverage our past mistakes into like weapons that we can win with, is this idea that we hate how much turnover our roster, and I personally hate how much turnover our roster has had. And as someone that believes so much in how much of a leg up synergy gives you, like I am not interested in this roster turning over. Like I will be very upset if we have a lot of turnover mid-season going into next season. Like it will have to be like things will have to be very, very wrong for me to say like this is not something that we're going to ride out, because I think I think we're going to be a great team this upcoming season, but to be the best, I don't think you can just like throw together a great team and they will instantly be the best. Like we need like to get to the next level, because I think we are very high. I hope that we're very high tier right now, but to get to where I want us to be, like we gotta stick around and we gotta build. And so that helps, right? Like that helps when like players know that we've learned that lesson, that we're not looking to flip players. And the other thing, people talked about this. I think people have talked about this. Is like trade restrictions, right? So there are trade restrictions in the contracts that can talk about like, oh, like the player's permission is needed for a trade, or
Right.
like they can be pushed down to a contenders team, which isn't relevant now,
Right.
but like when everyone had an academy team, right? And we have always, that's another thing that like when players whisper about things, we are always very, very forthcoming in encouraging players to say like, we're just going to give you this because like it doesn't matter, because I'm never going to force you to go to a team that you don't want to go to.
Yes.
So like you don't even have to fight for it. I'm just going to put it there.
Yes.
So I think that helps, right? Like just like again, like having like that history, having like the like the conversation around these things, like be like players know that you're an org that's not going to try to put them in a bad situation.
Right. Okay, I think as like a last major subject we should talk about is, of course, your season 4 coming up. I feel like if we're looking now, of course, there's a possibility that we think everything is fine once again, and then we at the start of the season find out once again you're riding the wave once more. But as it looks, just with the quality of the players and the team that you've built, it feels like we're at the dawn of another redemption arc, possibly maybe in tandem with Dallas this season. And one similar that, for instance, the Shanghai Dragons and the Florida Mayhem have gone through, having been the worst teams in the Overwatch League, and then becoming one of the best teams in the Overwatch League. So you had to make a lot of tough decisions, also a lot of like things that worked out well. But for instance, one that is interesting is that you decided to part ways with JJANU. How did that decision go?
That was extremely hard, and frankly, parting ways with every player that is not coming back for season 4 of the Justice was really painful. Every single one of so one of the things that I just kind of do is like I try and get like regular touch points with the players and ask like, are they happy with the org? Are they happy that they're here? And at the end of the season, every single player wanted to come back. Like if it was under a like activating a +1, if it was renegotiating a new contract, every single player wanted to come back. So every player that did not come back was like extremely painful for us, because we had also gone through like some crap together, right? We gone through for most of the players like a tough season. We like really bonded. We had spent insane amounts of time preparing for the playoffs. Like the amount of time that we spent scrimmaging and watching VODs, like we had really become a family. So that was extremely hard. And all the more so with JJANU, someone that we knew was a top X%, like a very skilled player in their role. For us, one of the things that we really liked about Fury was the flexibility that we talked about. That I think when you pair Fury with Mag, we're approaching that area similar to where I talked about with the Shock, where like I don't want there to be a meta where I have to like sit back and be like, oh, okay, do we have to take like a weird angle to this? Like I don't want to jinx us, but like I want it to be a situation where we can say, no matter what the meta is, like, okay, we have 2 of the best tanks in this meta. Doesn't matter what it is.
Right.
Like, Ball Diva, like, don't care. Like, we have 2 of the best tanks in this meta. And Fury really does that for us. I think JJANU, for the end of the season for the Justice, was perfect in that at that point we were kind of in that world of there's a couple metas where like we built this team. We were like, listen, if we kind of roll the dice and we end up with like the perfect meta, JJANU can be the best tank on multiple tanks. But can he be the best off tank on every tank? I don't think so. And so I think what Fury gave us was a little bit more of that. Again, like when you're kind of moving from one tier to the next, what gets you to those tiers, and getting kind of to some level of meta proofness with your roster is very important. So I think Fury gives us that, and then Rhea gives us a really exciting upside potential. I think Rhea has his own redemption arc. Has a couple, like, he gives us again like that flexibility with double off tank, but he also has a much higher ceiling than I think most people are expecting, and so I think he will see less playtime than Fury. But we're excited about him like long term as a player, and his development in the league.
Can you talk about the niche in terms of, like, for instance, what could fans expect Rhea to play? What kind of metas need to happen other than maybe the double off tank?
I think outside of the double off tank, and something that most teams that you look at, they either have like 2 off tanks and 1 main tank, or the opposite. And then oftentimes what you'll have is you'll give someone an opportunity to just kind of like specialize and grind at one thing. And I do think that Rhea's ceiling is high enough that if he just grinds, if D.Va is out of the rotation for as long as she has been and continues to be, maybe not D.Va, Furious D.Va is kind of special. there are other heroes like a Roadhog, for example, where if it's something that's going to come into the rotation so quickly, like for example, like Roadhog is actually a perfect example. So at the end of the last season meta, he all of a sudden became extremely powerful. We knew everyone was going to use him, or we felt that everyone should be using him. But we also knew that at the end of that month, once he got predictably nerfed, no one was ever going to use him again. And what we like about Rhea is that Rhea I think really has this high ceiling where if we kind of prepare or we kind of see any of this stuff coming, we can say like, okay, Fury gets to continue kind of playing this set of tanks, but we believe that Rhea can get strong enough at this one to actually be like our starting off tank for a month or a meta. It's hard. Like it's a great place for us to be in that I get to wonder like if I'm not talking up my players too much, as opposed to having like defend all of our players.
Right.
But like, yeah, like Rhea is definitely a victim of like that short-term memory of the league, right? Like Rhea was really struggling with like an injury issue that we believe is now very much in the rearview mirror, and also was struggling with an org. Like I think there were situations where the org kind of was setting a direction that they wanted to go with the roster, and Rhea wasn't part of it despite being the better player. And then you kind of get into this issue where you're not getting play time, you're not getting scrim time, and so like you're just out of the loop on the team. So I think Rhea has continued to improve since the last time we saw them really being quite dominant. So I don't think it's gonna be like the Mag and Fury show, right? I think that we are going to see Rhea in like a very real off tank capacity. I'm just not sure what yet.
The way this worked is kind of interesting, and perhaps the next question is going to sound like I'm trying to imply something or get you to admit something about that particular signing. But as Rhea put ink to the contract that he had, were you aware of the possibility that Fury would enter the market and that you guys would be interested?
We knew that Fury was going to be a free agent, right? So we knew Fury was going to be a free agent, and so it was going to have to be like they were going to have the similar position to Decay, where like even for like 5 minutes they had to like legally be a free agent,
right?
So Fury was like on our, so we had like a list of like we knew we wanted Rhea, and then we knew that we wanted 1 main tank and 2 off tanks. And so I think Rhea JJANU would have been an extremely strong pairing. I think that we could have gone into the season with Mag, JJANU, Rhea, and been very, very happy. But when it kind of became evident that Fury was interested in like other opportunities, and at least hearing other teams out, then we were like, oh, okay. Like Fury and Rhea, we think gives us a better chance as a team than JJANU and Rhea did.
It's kind of interesting. Like if I source my brain, especially among the top tier teams. Now, of course, like the ones that have large rosters, exempt, like the Shock and the Dragons. Even like in the top tier, let's say, for instance, the Dallas Fuel or the Florida Mayhem. Mm-hmm. They kind of only have 1 player each for the tank roles. What stands out to you guys that, because, okay, I understand we had double off tank metas last year. That sort of sets a precedent that this exists in Overwatch, also fairly certain, right? Now, I don't know how much, for instance, even the double flex support occurring regularly in the Overwatch League necessarily says about the intrinsic properties of the game. Meaning, it could be double main tank next season as well. And
Sure.
it could be Mercy Lucio. And suddenly you have to split your main support in half, right?
Yeah.
So how did you arrive at the double off-tank decision?
Yeah, so a big part of what worked for us for Rhea was fitting into like the division that we had for the team. And so Rhea signed with us quite a bit earlier than we announced it. I don't think that's super publicly aware yet, but Rhea signed with us fairly early on. And what we really, really liked about that was at the point where we signed Rhea was not joining like a super team. Rhea was not like joining this team that like had like all of the pieces together. Rhea just like really believed specifically in Supreme, but also in like the direction that we were building the team. And so I think a big part of why we were happy to sign Rhea more so than like, I don't think that we're sitting here thinking like, oh yeah, like we've like kind of thought about, will it be double main tank or double off tank? Probably double off tank. So we'll sign Rhea. It was more of, we know that like Mag and Fury can be our 1-2. And so if we're going to have another, like we like the idea of having a third tank in the rotation, let's have to be someone that we really believe in and go with that over like a player that maybe is like a slight percentage better, but is like much more focused on like, they're going to want to like start a certain number of games. They're going to want like a really high salary. And even, I think the point you're bringing up is great, because even if you layer onto the possibility of double main support, double main tank, we're also sitting here with the possibility of what is Overwatch 2 going to look like? Right. And is Overwatch League going to be immediately pulled into Overwatch 2? And is there going to be like a big enough change that like these conventional roles don't feel
right
like they fit anymore? And in that world, a lot of our contracts do stretch into when we believe that like that would be impacting us. And with Rhea, if you have no idea what the roles are going to be, it feels to me and to us like a smart bet to say like, good player, good attitude, good skill set, believes in like the direction that we're going. And so like we'll see what the next iteration of the game or the meta is. Like we'll bet on them as a person more than we'll bet on like their specific skill set right now.
Yeah. And that feels like a long-term decision, which once again feeds into your idea of like wanting to have little turnover as possible, right?
Exactly. Yep. Yeah.
A player I'm really interested about is because I feel like this player, I've been high on Closer for a long time. Also,
good for you.
Closer, a lot of people forget that he's an Overwatch League champion. Yep. I also think, of course, he didn't play as much as Nuss in the Spitfire at the time. Then, like, he's part of the Dallas Fuel. I don't know how distinguished you can look in a team that isn't doing very well. Once again, like, hinting towards the same issues that we've had with Rhea, like, you know, having these obstacles in his way. Now, I also heard that when I found out about Closer, that a lot of teams were quite high on him and quite surprised that he was that good. Also sort of illustrating that this mindset is also sort of persistent in Overwatch League teams, but I think they are kind of, you know, they kind of learn to appreciate other players once again when they see them in trials. So what was the selection process for Closer like? And did you take, did you ask Decay about what was it like to play with him at Dallas?
We did, yeah. And in kind of typical Decay fashion, it was like positive, but not like overly singing the praises and not overly negative. Right. Like Decay is very quiet. Like Decay is like a very soft-spoken, just like very even keeled kind of person. And yeah, I think Closer fit into our kind of profile of high-performing player that probably didn't have the right environment, situation, whatever it was, to kind of achieve to their full potential. And I do think one of the things that benefited, this is a total guess. I have no evidence whatsoever to back this up, but I think that one of the things that benefited us is that we I believe that we were one of the teams that was very quick to get on like the closer train.
Mhm.
And I think that many teams care a lot about like how fans are going to react to their signings, and they care more than they should, or maybe their owners care more than they should, or like someone in the chain is going to get upset that like a player that like the hive mind has perceived as an underperformer was signed, and that happened, right? Like when
Yes.
like whispers and stuff came out about closer, there were a lot of people that were like, I thought you guys were building like a good team.
Yeah.
Like what is this?
Yeah.
And I was just like, I don't care. I want to sign players that people are excited about.
Yeah.
But like if we have all of the evidence, again, like if like the one consistent thing that we've seen is that like fans and the, I mean, to your point, not even just fans, like everybody in the Overwatch League is inconsistent and how much they choose to remember about a player's history. And so we're hoping that we can rewrite that for closer. And I think that very quickly it can be like the Dallas few years could just be like a blip in the radar from like a Overwatch League champion to someone that was put back into a system that worked for them and was back on top.
Right. I watched a Q&A session with you and Supreme, and it sounded like there is a potential that you guys aren't quite done this offseason. Now, of course, there are pretty stellar flex DPS still available. And even though you keep reiterating that Tuba is definitely also your guy, it like a lot of teams have doubled up on the position. Now, the elephant in the room are two names, mostly, I think, that a lot of people are surprised that they aren't picked up yet. And it's Rascal and Libero. Has the Justice looked at these players?
We have. And I think I'm really, really proud of our tryout process this offseason. Like I talked it up a fair amount early on. And it's kind of gotten to the point where I'm not sure, I can't say it 100%, but I want to say that like 90 to 100% of like any good player that was a free agent or was considering to go anywhere else tried out for the Justice at some point. Like we had like dream scenarios of just like who's who of all-star players across two different rosters for like our tryouts. It was very, very good. I think what we're looking at right now is there is the possibility that we can add more players, but we don't want to build out this team so far without having had the chance to like properly scrim and like feel it out. Because like what if we get to that scenario, right? Like, what if we sign another flex DPS player and then we have time like before the season starts and we get like some really good quality scrims in, we like bring people over. Like what if God forbid like something health related happens or travel related, or more realistically we realize, oh, I guess we maybe we like mis-scouted this role a little bit and there actually is a big gap here. So we're trying to be patient. We're trying to be as patient as we can. I think other teams probably are too. I think there's kind of this mad scramble to get the 7 that you needed going into next year. And then after you kind of hit that number, like the threshold to make a signing decision. I mean, it's also like there's the competitive side of me and then the business side. Like the business side, I think like every owner or manager is whispering to the competitive side is, if you don't sign someone until February, you don't have to start paying them until February. So like that's also like weighing in the back of some people's minds.
Sure.
I think for us, like we were very willing to sign a roster that we believed in earlier than most. So that's not really on the table for us. But it is, when you kind of look at some of these players that are still on the table and it's like this is a proven player. Like how are they not picked up yet? Like those are the things that are dancing around in people's heads, right? Like teams probably want a chance to scrimmage. They want a chance to see how like a core that they set meshes and then make a decision from there. And that's where we're at as well.
Right. Do you think there will be a second wave of signings maybe later into the offseason generally? Because this idea of mean and lean, I swear I've heard it behind the scenes for 2 years. And somehow it hasn't happened before. so I wonder if it's the same situation this time around.
I think some teams will. I think it will be more than it has been in the past. But yeah, I don't think we're anywhere near done with signings. Like there's some big things. Like there's still like updates. Like there's BlizzCon. There's like a long time before the season starts. There's official announcements about like format and stuff that have to take place, right? And so if it's something where you're buying 12 flights like every other week to do like some form of like away games that are rehashed because like COVID has like vaccines have really popped off, then like that weighs into your mind versus, oh, like we're just going to stay here for the rest of the season. Okay, like moving from a 9 to an 11 player roster doesn't feel as painful anymore. So yeah, I think that I don't know if it's going to be like a second. I don't think there's going to be like a second triggering event where there's just like all of a sudden like it's going to be, oh, like the format is announced or like something like that is announced, and like that immediately means a bunch of players that like teams kind of had in a whiteboard and they were waiting for like the event to push them over the edge. I don't think that's going to happen, but I think that there are going to be like trickling in signings all the way up until the beginning of the season. Some teams are set with what they have right now, but I think most are where we're at right now, where they're like, you know what, if the season started tomorrow, we feel good. But like there are scenarios that could happen where we would want to like make changes.
Right. As we sort of think of the next season, apparently there's one big decision that is on the table theoretically for teams, and it's which region they want to play in. Now, the Justice also has a full Korean roster, has the coaching staff, as you said, the translator and everything. Has that been on the table and considered at all for you guys?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we've thought about. Again, from both sides of the house, from the financial side and from the competitive side. Ultimately, I think a lot of that comes down to the ownership group. And one thing that not a lot of people know Mark Ein like closely, but like one of the things that a lot of the rhetoric that came out and that is very true of what he believes in for this team is like the local thing, right? So like his big like the drum that he was beating when he created this team was bringing esports to Washington D.C.
Right.
So I think that was gonna be a bit of a long shot for us, and it was also when we kind of talk a little bit about the list of priorities for players. Like one of the things that I always kind of pushed players that we're looking at to put on that list is like how much do you care about where you're going to play, and we immediately for a lot of players had to kind of put them down on the priority list if they were like, oh, I really want to play in Korea. Because that's awesome. And if that's where I was from, that's where all my friends and family were, I would too. But like, I don't want you to like convince yourself that you're going to be fine playing in the US and then hate it here, because like that just makes a headache for me. And that makes my team like frustrated. So all of the players that we've signed are very comfortable, and some of them even view it as like a net positive, and they are like wanting to pursue green cards and opportunities to be here longer term. So for us, I think it makes less sense. Again, like there's always some scenario where things could change. But from our ownership level and from our player buy-in level, like people are pretty happy here.
Right. What would you be happy with after the regular season is done, and what kind of a placement would you like to have?
Ooh. I think looking at the tiers, I would like us to be like an S tier team.
Right.
Like I would like us to be the team that like at the end of the season, if we are like in the conversation for like a very strong finish, people are like disappointed or like they're looking at something weird like the metas or something. Like I think that we have built a very strong team. I think like the conservative and like risk averse version of me, which is a fair amount of my role, is saying like solidly make the playoffs, right? Like not be a team that's on the bubble, not be a team that's having to do the like back of the napkin math at the end of the season. Like, oh, if we beat this team and that team loses, then we'll make it. Like we want to be a team that like, yeah, we will like comfortably get to the playoffs, and then if history serves as our example, some meta shift happens, and then we kind of know that like our hat is in the ring and hope that we can smartly shift to adapt to it. Stepping outside of my role and just like as my I think we have a shot, right? Like I think we have a shot. Like I think like there's things that can go wrong. But I think that some of the best teams got a little bit weaker. We'll see how things happen. I think we are probably going to, I hope, are going to be one of the teams that has the biggest diffs in overall performance last season to this season. So we'll see. And again, like that's internally that phrase is used a lot. Like just give ourselves a shot. You know, give ourselves a shot at doing something great. And I think we've given ourselves that.
Right. Yeah, then that was all the time we had today. Thank you a lot for sitting through these, sort of like going through the history of your competitive experience also throughout your teams.
Awesome. This is great. Yeah.
And yeah, then we like to say thank you and good luck next season.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was great talking to you. Always a pleasure. I think you're doing great stuff for the esports reporting industry. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.